Hey guys, tonight's story doesn't start with an explosion. There are no desperate signals from dying stars, no ancient alien ruins, and no sudden discoveries beneath the ice of Europa. Not this time. Instead, we begin with a question. One so quiet and so old that most people forget to ask it. What if we were first? What if, in all this cosmic silence, humanity isn't late to the party, but early? Before we dive in, go ahead and dim your lights. Maybe crack a window or turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum in the background. And if you enjoy these slow journeys through forgotten futures and quiet possibilities, you know what to do. Leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what the stars look like above your part of the world tonight. It's always comforting to see just how far these stories stretch. Now, settle in. Because tonight's question is stranger than any signal or artifact. What happens to a civilization that was never guided, never warned, never imitated? A species that emerged alone in a universe built for waiting. We're not going to talk about conspiracies, or secret alien bases, or things buried on the moon. We're going to talk about silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that follows when no one answers. For billions of years, the universe unfolded without an audience. Stars formed, planets cooled, time moved forward. And then, once, on a tiny world orbiting an average star, life looked up and began to wonder. So tonight, we're stepping into that silence, into the great expanse of possibility where humanity might be, not the latest intelligence, but the first. And that changes everything. The most uncomfortable truth in astronomy isn't how big the universe is. It's how quiet. Every time we point a radio telescope at the sky, we're not just listening for signs of life. We're listening for reassurance, for proof that we're not the first ones to open our eyes. But the stars don't respond. The void doesn't echo. It just holds us in place, as if waiting to see what we'll do with the silence. Scientists used to call it the Great Filter, a theoretical wall that all civilizations either hit or somehow pass through. The idea was simple. If intelligent life is common, then where is everybody? If it's rare, then maybe, just maybe, we're early. But early doesn't mean special. It means alone. And being first comes with a different kind of weight. On Earth, we grew up surrounded by life. We imitated, competed, adapted. But in space, there's no mimicry, no example, no warning. Just stars, burning without message. Gas giants, swirling without memory. And the black, infinite, unbroken, indifferent. When the Voyager probes left the solar system, they carried messages in golden discs, songs, greetings, maps. A bottle thrown into a dark sea. But if no one's out there to catch it, it becomes something else. A time capsule for no one. A monument to our own optimism. And maybe that's what being first is. Not about arrival, but about narrative. You are not the result of history. You are its beginning. The blueprint, not the product. In the early decades of exoplanet discovery, there was hope. Dozens of Earth-like planets, hundreds of habitable zones. But habitability isn't the same as habitation. And year after year, signal after signal, the numbers piled up. 0 confirmed civilizations, 0 transmissions, 0 artifacts. The SETI archive stretched wider than the Milky Way, and still nothing. Not even static that could be mistaken for intelligence. Just physics, chemistry, gravity, and dust. The kind of dust that accumulates not from chaos, but from patience. We thought silence would feel peaceful. It doesn't. It feels incomplete. Like arriving in a city with streets, buildings, signs, but no people. A constructed reality with no constructor. And so we began rewriting the question. Not, are we alone? But, what if this is ours? Not ours to take, ours to begin. Because if we are first, if the universe is empty not by tragedy but by sequence, then everything changes. Morality changes. Expansion changes. Even responsibility changes. You don't just become explorers. You become precedent. The laws you write are the first. The mistakes you make are foundational. Your ruins, if you leave any, will be the oldest ones ever built. Every footprint, every emission, every broadcast becomes history, and the weight of that can break a species or elevate it. In the early 2100s, as humanity began its slow crawl beyond Mars, debates about contact gave way to something stranger. Existential infrastructure. Should we build monuments that tell our story? Should we encode warnings about war, extinction, hubris, not for aliens and for ourselves, for whoever comes next, if anyone ever does? One project, the Lumen Array, was launched near Titan's orbit, a series of massive reflective plates etched with human DNA, planetary location, and the phrase, "We were here, we tried," not a claim, not a threat, just a whisper into dark wind, because by then we had stopped expecting a reply. We'd started writing instead, composing the first verses of a history that had no ancestors, and that realization, the idea that we were no one's descendants, began to shape how we saw everything. We weren't the youngest minds in the galaxy. We were the eldest children of an empty house, and the stars above us weren't hiding others. They were waiting for us to decide what it meant to be alone, and still continue. It began so gently that most people didn't believe it was real. Not at first. A shift in shadow length. A faint pull to the side when pouring water. A slow, unexplainable creaking of door hinges that hadn't moved in a decade. Someone placed a marble on a perfectly level shelf and watched it begin to roll. Not quickly, not far, just enough to whisper a new direction. The earth was moving, not spinning, not yet, but no longer still. A tilt, a lean, a stretch, like a body trying to remember how to walk. For years, humanity had lived inside pause, inside the parentheses of planetary history, a world without sunrise, without rhythm, a half sentence waiting to finish itself. But now, the comma had lifted. The next word had begun. In the outer zones, at the edges of cold and light, wind returned, not as a gust, as a breath, a single breeze that rustled the dry grass near the crater rim, then stopped, then came again. People held scarves to their faces. They cried, not because it was strong, it wasn't, but because it wasn't imaginary. On ocean shelves where water had once hung in stasis, currents formed, weak at first, meandering, but unmistakable. Buoys turned. Kelp swayed. Old salt lifted from the floor like memory. In the line cities, clocks blinked uncertainly, then froze again. Not from failure, from confusion. A few systems recorded millisecond deviations in gravitational signature. A scientist quietly wrote the phrase "axial recovery event" in her logbook, then erased it. It sounded too official, too bold, too much like hope. But still, the sensors kept humming. The ground, once mute, now responded differently to weight. Footsteps echoed longer. Vibrations lasted a little more. When people walked, the earth seemed to notice. It wasn't rotation. It wasn't spin. But it was momentum. Micro-momentum. The kind that builds. The kind that becomes. The boy with the earth's voice stopped singing one morning. Just sat still, eyes closed, listening. Then he smiled. No one knew why. But the town wrote the date down anyway. Not the time. There was no time. just the moment. The morning the boy smiled. Elsewhere, the machines began to shift their behavior. The container crane paused its loop for the first time in decades. A server deep beneath the line adjusted its internal clock forward by 6 seconds, unprompted. A motion sensor activated in an empty corridor and did not reset. A satellite turned its lens half a degree off axis. A door that had remained shut since the great stillness opened with a click and waited. It didn't close again. In the underground cities, people began to prepare. Not for catastrophe, for change. They packed quietly. Not to run, to be ready. Some built carts, others printed maps. Some sat by the same walls they had always known and whispered goodbye to the stones. Farewell, not because they hated the stillness, but because it had lasted long enough. On the old surface, sun-facing windows grew slightly brighter. Not measurably, not visibly, but perceptibly. A painter in the quiet zone held a canvas to the light and tilted her head. "It's warmer," she said. No one argued. That night, people slept differently. Not deeper, but with dreams. And in those dreams, motion. Doors opening to corridors that curved. Roads bending into distance. Oceans with tides. Not memories, prophecies. Soft ones, kind ones. Dreams without alarm. In a deep shaft near the core monitoring facility known as Bastion, a vibration was recorded that did not match any known profile. Not volcanic, not tectonic. A wave, gentle, rolling, like breath through stone. It moved beneath them and kept going, for hours, then silence, and then the wind. Real wind, 3 seconds long. Enough to lift the corner of a tarp, to spin a wind chime someone had hung out of sentiment. It was enough. No sirens followed, no cataclysm, just quiet. But this time, it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of stillness, the silence before a beginning. And then the planet continued. Not into chaos, not into recovery, into something new. No one declared the earth healed. No one said the spin had returned. But they felt it, in the walls, in the ground, in each other. Not rotation, not yet, but readiness. Like the world had opened one eye, taken one breath, and decided, maybe, just maybe, to begin again. Long before we sent messages into the dark, we tried to measure it, the silence, not just in sound, but in expectation. Early astronomers knew the sky was quiet, but they thought it was temporary. A pause before discovery, an intermission before the signal. Every decade, new telescopes scanned wider slices of the sky, listening, filtering, calculating. And every time they improved the resolution, the noise got clearer, and the silence got louder. The universe didn't just lack signal, it lacked debris. There were no derelict ships in orbit, no shattered stations drifting between stars, no mega structures eclipsing their suns, nothing to suggest passage. The roads weren't empty because traffic had moved on. They were empty because no one had ever driven them. It was as if the galaxy had been waiting all this time not to receive someone, but to be written upon. And so, humanity began to map the silence itself, not with coordinates or star charts, but with intention. The cartography of silence became a field of study around 2170, a hybrid between astrophysics, philosophy, and information theory. Its goal wasn't to locate others, but to define the shape of nothing. If the universe was a message with no sender, what was its syntax? What patterns existed in the absence of contact? Researchers looked for gaps, absences, statistical anomalies, not to find civilizations, but to find where they hadn't been. One of the earliest breakthroughs came not from a discovery, but from a pattern of absences. regions of space where star formation should have been higher, where metals should have been more abundant, where entropy had played too kindly. Some called them gardens, zones where nature had been strangely efficient, as if someone had cleaned up before leaving, or perhaps before anyone arrived. That idea changed the conversation. If we were first, then perhaps we weren't just early. We were being given space, not literally, structurally. The universe, after all, doesn't reward effort, but it can allow time. And in those carved-out corridors of deep simplicity, we began to build. Not ships, not probes, ideas, frameworks, ways of thinking that didn't assume company. Entire philosophies emerged that treated solitude as a cosmic constant, not a problem to be solved. Religions adapted, prayer changed tone. Less who made us, and more what can we make. Entire texts devoted themselves to the ethics of firstness, whether a species with no ancestors can ever truly claim wisdom. And behind all of it, the silence remained. Not cruel, not kind, just present. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a punishment. It was the backdrop of a stage that had never seen a performance. And so we began to design, not for necessity, but for permanence. Structures that could last 1 billion years, not to survive, but to mean. In the asteroid fields near Ceres, artists sculpted orbiting installations using gravity and reflective glass. From a distance, they spelled nothing, but from a precise angle above Mars, they formed a question mark. No one took credit. That was the point. The galaxy was no longer a resource. It was a canvas. One probe launched toward the galactic center didn't carry instruments. It carried a message. A single statement etched in elemental code into a tungsten sphere. We began here. We do not know why, but we chose to continue. That sphere won't reach anyone, but it doesn't have to. Its value isn't in contact, it's in assertion, that even in the absence of echo we spoke. Not for validation, but for alignment. The silence isn't empty. It's receptive, waiting not to respond but to contain. And so, humanity redefined its mission. We weren't explorers anymore. We were authors, archivists, builders of the prologue. And each unmapped region, each signalless void, became a place to inscribe not warnings or flags, but presence. We were here. We listened. We chose peace. Some called it naive, others called it elegant. But over time, the maps changed. They no longer centered Earth. They no longer measured distance in light years. They measured it in silence. How long had this region remained unbroken? What might it hold? What did it refuse to give up? And slowly, those maps became art. Not instructions, invitations. Because if someone ever came later, years, centuries, eons from now, we wanted them to find not dominance, not monuments, but a record of restraint. The trace of a species that chose to wait, to watch, to build in the quiet. Not because we had no other choice, but because we understood that firstness is not privilege, it is responsibility. The deeper we mapped the silence, the more it felt like the universe was leaving room. Not absence exactly, not a blank slate, but a kind of careful unfinishedness. Galaxies that hadn't yet collided, stars that hadn't yet burned out, planets still cooling. It wasn't a museum, it was scaffolding, and we were the first to climb it. Humanity began to catalogue these untouched regions not by resource value or gravitational potential, but by narrative role. What kind of story they could hold. Some regions were labelled stage worlds, places too pristine, too balanced to be accidental. Others were dubbed echo voids, zones so vast and quiet they almost invited tragedy. We didn't populate them, we preserved them. Not because we were noble, because we were terrified of becoming noise. The early centuries of expansion were riddled with mistakes. Failed colonies, environmental collapses, habitats that decayed into echoes of our own impatience. We learned, slowly, painfully, and we started writing differently. We stopped sending messages in languages. We started sending systems, instructions on how to see, how to feel gravity, how to decode matter. Not assuming shared culture, only shared physics, because if we truly were the first, then every transmission had to function like scaffolding. Not conclusions, but beginnings. In the Libration archives near Saturn, scholars began to assemble a text known only as the primer. Not a manifesto, not a warning, a tone setting, a document meant for minds that hadn't evolved yet. It contained no dates, no names, no coordinates, only relationships, ratios, the beauty of orbital decay, the grief of entropy, the silence between pulses. It was the closest thing humanity had ever made to a welcome map for minds unknown. And even if no one ever read it, we continued, because by then we understood. Our work wasn't about being heard. It was about not being the last, because firstness without legacy is just isolation. But firstness with intention is something else entirely, a kind of authorship, a willingness to make meaning before anyone is there to receive it. One probe, sent toward a distant red dwarf, contained only a sphere of compressed hydrogen and a single image. 2 hands, not touching, just reaching. The file name was Patience JPG. No explanation, no philosophy, just the gesture. And perhaps that was enough. On Earth, culture adapted. Fiction changed. Space operas vanished. There were no evil empires waiting. No fallen civilizations to uncover. No battles for survival. Just us, suspended in the long amber of the first moment. Stories turned inward. Not about aliens. About purpose, not about conflict, about continuity. In one of the last analog cinemas on the planet, a film played to an empty room. Its title was a number. The dialogue was minimal, the visuals slow. A woman walked through abandoned cities, planting seeds of glass. At the end, she left, not to flee, to make space. That film was never released. But copies of it found their way onto servers orbiting Neptune, encoded into soil samples, printed onto the walls of seed vaults. Not because it was brilliant, but because it felt true. That being first isn't about going far. It's about making sure there's something left when others arrive. Not gold, not monuments, just a trail, a hum, a resonance that says quietly, we passed this way. We built what we could. We tried not to break what we found. One last project, launched in secret, still floats somewhere beyond the heliopause. A silent array of reflective panels, arranged in a Fibonacci spiral, rotating once every 11 hours. No message, no broadcast, just form, shape, pattern. A signal, not in data, but in the insistence of structure. A way of saying, something here understood. Something here remembered, and in that structure, perhaps, is the clearest map of all. A record, not of where we went, but how we chose to move. Not to conquer, not to finish, but to begin gently, and let the silence shape the rest. The farther we went, the more the silence began to look like us. Not literally. There were no mirrors in deep space, no faces in the void. But something in the absence began to resemble our own shape. Every unanswered transmission felt less like a disappointment and more like an echo we hadn't realized we were sending. Not a message, a reflection. Because when you are first, the silence does not just surround you. It becomes you. It copies your shape, your rhythms, your fears. It gives you nothing back but the outline of your own uncertainty. And slowly, People began to understand that exploring the universe wasn't about finding others. It was about finding what we had become in their absence. Across the outer settlements, new architecture emerged, not optimized for efficiency or colonization, but for observation. Cities built like instruments, walls designed to resonate with deep frequencies, homes that curved with planetary magnetic fields, tuned not to comfort, but to coherence. Not because we expected contact, but because we wanted to know what we sounded like in case someone ever did listen. It became a kind of ritual, not science, not faith, just preparation, a posture of attention. Because when the only voice you hear is your own, you begin to listen differently, carefully. Not to hear yourself louder, but to hear yourself clearer. In one orbital colony over Gliese 581d, every citizen was assigned a day of silence each cycle. No speech, no transmission, no writing. Not as punishment, as alignment. The belief was simple. If you contribute to the silence, you better understand what it means. Over time, those silent days became holy. People described them not as empty, but full of presence, weight, observation, not of the universe, but of themselves. On the lunar archive station known as Hollow Point, a deep space poet named Asher Reen published a volume titled Reflections Without Witness. It contained no punctuation, no narrative, no structure, just line after line of unanswered questions. If the stars never reply, are we still right to keep asking? If we are the first, are we also the last? What if memory requires witness? The collection spread like wildfire through the data rings, not because of its literary merit, but because it voiced something everyone had begun to feel, that the universe wasn't resisting contact. It simply didn't know how to reflect anything but what we gave it, and what we gave it was ourselves. At scale, the silence had become our mirror, and the more we looked into it, the more we realized we were shaping it with every step, every colony, every broadcast, every hesitation. One sociologist described the phenomenon as cosmic dramaturgy, the idea that when there is no audience, you perform for absence itself, hoping the act is enough to justify itself. Whole institutions were formed around this concept. Not temples, not universities, something between. Places where you went to learn how to act like someone was watching, even if no one was. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because someday, maybe, someone would be. And when that happened, we wanted the record to show that we had behaved as if presence mattered, even when we were alone. In a desert station beneath Europa's surface, a sculptor spent 14 years carving a single continuous spiral into the ice. No explanation, no encryption, just geometry. It melted the following decade. But in that spiral, something lingered. Not a message, but an ethic. That art made without an audience is not a waste. It is a rehearsal for meaning. And that idea began to spread. Across the stars, on slow ships and scattered domes, humans began to live like witnesses, to the void, to each other, to time. Stories changed again. Now the heroes were caretakers, not conquerors. Characters who maintained signals that would never be answered, who recorded days with no events, who walked ancient halls built for someone who might never arrive, not out of hope, but out of obligation. The nobility of context, the discipline of presence, and in doing so, they gave shape to the silence, not as enemy, not as question, but as material, something to build with, something to leave behind, something that might one day look back and say, you were not the last, you were the first, and you built well. At some point, the silence became architecture, not metaphorically, physically. Structures were designed not to impress, not to defend, not even to shelter, but to be seen. Not now, later. If not by others, then by time itself. Some outposts were constructed entirely underground, not to hide from radiation, but to preserve ideas beneath the churn of surface change. Others were left exposed on purpose, their decay part of the message. We were here, and this is what the wind did to us. The idea wasn't to endure. It was to leave a footprint that made sense even after erosion, even after language, even after memory. One such project, the Listening Stones, was built on a tidally locked planet where the sun never moved. Engineers arranged obsidian monoliths across the twilight belt in mathematically perfect arcs, each tuned to vibrate faintly in response to solar wind. The effect was barely perceptible. You could only hear it when you pressed your ear against the rock and waited in silence. But the sound, when it came, was unmistakably intentional. A low, harmonic pulse. A heartbeat not of the planet, but of design. No sign marked the installation. No name claimed credit. Because the point wasn't recognition. The point was reception. That someday something would press itself against silence and hear us echoing back. In orbit around Proxima Centauri b, an unmanned archive known as Vesper carried nothing but questions, not answers, not discoveries, just questions carved into alloys and cast into space. What is language before it is spoken? Can entropy be kind? If the first civilization leaves no record, does the second still arrive? These were not meant to be solved. They were meant to be felt. Because being first doesn't mean having answers. It means having the burden of asking out loud into a vacuum that cannot reply. And that burden shaped humanity, not into gods, not into explorers, into caretakers of a universe that might one day wake up. If not today, then later. If not in this age, then in another. If not because of us, then after us. That long thinking gave rise to a discipline called echo philosophy, a field not about certainty, but resonance. Scholars asked, what kind of thoughts survive silence? What kinds of ethics echo well? They studied ancient human myths, not for their truth, but for their shape, not for who they pleased, but for how they traveled. The stories that lasted weren't loud. They were adaptable, simple, honest. And so, new myths were written, not as fantasy, but as ritual. Fables with no monsters, no saviors, just decisions, choices made in quiet. A common tale involved a person tasked with planting trees that wouldn't grow until after their death. Not because of climate, but because the soil had to learn first. The moral wasn't patience, it was placement. That doing the right thing in the right time matters more than seeing the outcome. That resonated. Even in the engineering schools, satellites were now programmed with failure modes designed not just to protect hardware, but to leave beauty in decay. A failed probe might spin into a coded orbit, forming part of a constellation visible for only a few weeks every 100 years. A slow blinking pattern that says, someone tried, someone thought to make this gentle. This idea of graceful failure became doctrine, not out of pessimism, out of elegance. The silence, after all, could not be conquered, only understood. And so, humans stopped looking for company as proof of value. They began to live as though the void itself was enough of a reason to speak softly, build carefully, and leave room. Not because they expected applause, but because they knew that one day, perhaps, another civilization might finally appear and inherit not ruins, not weapons, not arrogance, but a foundation. A quiet, intentional starting point. The kind of gift only the first can give. And by then, the silence will not be empty. it will be full of us. The longer humanity lived without a reply, the more it began to reshape its identity, not around what it could discover, but around what it could become. In the early centuries of silence, cultures clung to their pasts, repeating myths, reimagining conflicts, projecting old fears into new constellations. But over time, the absence of external influence began to erode those shapes. Without contrast, without opposition, without even observation, identity became fluid, and fluidity turned into freedom, not from consequence, but from expectation. Art became less about representation and more about presence. Music, once tied to rhythm and shared language, became tonal landscapes designed for solitude. Sculptures were made from magnetic fields, not to be seen, but to be felt slowly by walking through them. Languages shifted. Across outposts and station rings, dialects formed that relied on silence as grammar. Pauses carried meaning. Intonation fell away. Conversations unfolded like tides, with long spaces between responses. A single phrase might take a day to finish, not because people were unsure, but because they had time. Because in a universe without interruption, you speak differently. And when you are the only one speaking, you listen to yourselves more carefully. Education changed, not just in content, but in cadence. Lessons weren't delivered, they were planted. A child might be introduced to a concept at age 6, left to wonder about it for years, and then return to it with questions instead of answers. Learning became a spiral, not a ladder. The old urgency, the race to discover, to conquer, to innovate, slowly unraveled. What replaced it wasn't apathy, it was stewardship, not of knowledge, but of narrative. If no other voice ever joined the cosmic story, then humanity's job was not to fill it with data, but with coherence, with care. One orbital library, known only as the Ark of Slow Thought, stored not books, but moments. Curated recordings of decisions made under ambiguity, conflicts avoided, kindness chosen. Its architects believed that ethics, more than science, would be the true gift left behind, because science could be rediscovered. But mercy? That needed an origin. And so humans began to record themselves differently, not to boast, not to archive, but to confess. Not everything had gone well. There were still wars, still divisions, still waste. But within the long silence, accountability began to sound like courage. This was our mistake. Here is how we changed. This was the last time we let fear decide. Such admissions were carved into metals, broadcast into slow beam loops, hidden in gravity wells. Not because they expected judgment, but because they understood legacy. That when no one else has spoken yet, your story becomes the blueprint. And if it is built from denial, then everything that follows inherits that fracture. So honesty became survival. In the outer colonies, children were raised to think of their daily actions not as private choices, but as future evidence. Live like a beginning, some teachers would say. Live as if you are the first page someone will ever read. It wasn't pressure, it was clarity. And through that lens, even tragedy became usable. Failures were mapped, regrets were chronicled. Not to dwell, but to refine. To leave behind something better than silence. Not louder, just more human, more whole. In one settlement buried beneath the methane plains of a distant exoplanet, a community rebuilt its entire social structure around shared authorship. There were no leaders, only editors. No laws, only drafts. Each decision was treated as a chapter, open to revision, critique, and annotation. Their motto: if we are writing the first book, let it be worth rereading. Outsiders mocked them at first, but their model spread, slowly, quietly, because it worked, because it made people feel not important, but intentional. And in a universe where no one is watching, intention becomes the closest thing to meaning. It is the act of alignment without feedback, the belief that truth is not validated by audience, but by consistency, that kindness still matters, even when it echoes into the void, and that who we are, who we choose to be, is not diminished by being first. If anything, it is made more sacred. When a species becomes aware that it may be the only voice in the room, the purpose of speaking changes. Language stops being transactional. It stops being about survival, advantage, persuasion. It becomes ritual, not in the religious sense, but in the rhythmic, intentional world-building sense. Across the outer systems, entire communities began to treat communication not as noise, but as structure. Messages were no longer meant to inform. They were meant to shape reality. A conversation wasn't about sharing facts. It was about making the world more stable, more coherent, more understandable, even if only temporarily. One orbital society, known as the Mirror Accord, developed a cultural code where every spoken sentence had to be answered not with agreement or rejection, but with reflection. Not yes or no, but this is how I feel when I hear you. Not because they feared offense, because they believed every word carried forward the emotional geometry of their civilization. And that geometry mattered, that the shape of a sentence could change how a future mind understood the present. It wasn't about being correct. It was about being honest and traceable. And in time, this changed how stories were told. Narrative timelines grew looser. Endings disappeared. Characters became vessels for experience rather than arcs. One popular series of recorded dreams, collected over a century by anonymous contributors, contained no dialogue, no chronology, just scenes, moments. A child looking up at a red sky, a corridor full of artificial wind, a hand tracing a map with no labels. These fragments were encoded onto golden sheets and placed inside a derelict station orbiting a dead star. No one expected it to be found. That wasn't the point. The point was the act of placing it there, of completing the sentence, even if no one ever finished the conversation. In a way, that became the new mythology, not tales of gods or monsters, but tales of persistence, of beauty chosen without audience, of sorrow witnessed without need for explanation. An entire generation grew up with bedtime stories where the hero was not a warrior or explorer, but a keeper, someone who maintained a beacon, someone who carved pathways through dust so others might someday follow. Not because they were waiting, but because they believed in continuity, in slow momentum. And that idea of continuity began to reshape government itself. Leadership structures flattened, councils replaced hierarchies, decision-making extended across longer timelines. 10-year plans became 100-year plans. Constitutions were written not just for the living, but for hypothetical descendants. Not in terms of law, in terms of tone. Speak with care, act with context, choose with awareness of firstness. In one floating habitat over Neptune's upper atmosphere, a generation of youth developed an entire subculture around the concept of intentional anonymity. Artists would create vast, complex visual works, then dismantle them, leaving behind only a record of the process. To them, the universe wasn't asking for results. It was asking for sincerity, and the process, being observable, was enough. Being first didn't mean leaving behind monuments. It meant leaving behind integrity. Elsewhere, in the shadow of a fractured moon, a library was constructed out of magnetic dust. It could not be read with the eye. Only with instruments capable of measuring tiny variations in charge and pressure. The books it held were encoded with stories about grief, about disappointment, about choosing hope anyway. The title of the collection, We Felt Everything, and Still We Wrote. That became the ethos of a civilization with no mirror. Without others to reflect us, we reflected ourselves, not with vanity, but with precision, not to admire, to preserve. Because someday, if eyes ever find our remains, we wanted them to see us clearly, not perfectly, clearly. The silences, the failures, the brief moments of kindness, the tiny rituals of care, the choice over and over again to continue, not out of obligation, out of authorship, because we weren't just the first civilization. We were the first storytellers, and even if no one ever came next, we still believed the telling mattered. At first, time and space was borrowed from Earth. Rotations, revolutions, atomic clocks, tools designed for a planet with days and years. But as humanity expanded, those rhythms became obsolete. On a planet with a 400-hour day, what does morning mean? On a ship moving between stars, what does a year measure? The silence didn't just remove context, it removed synchronization. And with no one else to align to, humanity began to float, not in space, but in time. The concept of now dissolved. Cultures developed separate calendars, not based on celestial motion, but on cycles of internal meaning. A festival every 10,000 heartbeats. A holiday when a sensor hits a certain ambient tone. Time became personal, not standardized. And strangely, that didn't fragment civilization. It clarified it. Without imposed structure, people began to feel their own rhythms. When to work, when to rest, when to speak, when to reflect. They called it subjective chronology. Time as a mirror of need, not order. A traveler might move through 5 outposts in a month, and each one would greet them as if it were a different season. But it didn't feel chaotic. It felt like a song in 5 voices, harmonized by intention, not tempo. On distant planets with no sunrise, humans built artificial horizons, bands of light that dimmed and brightened in slow, uneven cycles, not to mimic Earth, but to allow anticipation, a way to feel passage, because passage, more than measurement, was what mattered. You didn't need clocks, you needed markers. This happened after the river froze. That was before the mirror grew cloudy. Memory adapted. History became topological. Events were recorded not by date, but by relation. Not year 312, but 4 generations after the first silence wall was built. And that relational time began to shape thinking. People stopped asking when, and started asking how long between. The past became a landscape, not a line. And in that landscape they found something unexpected. Patience. Without the pressure of deadlines or cosmic appointments, projects stretched. Not in laziness, in depth. A musician spent 28 subjective years composing a single piece of sound architecture, designed to only be heard once. Inside a chamber tuned to a specific atmospheric density on a moon that hadn't fully stabilized yet. The audience was estimated to arrive in 300 years. She wouldn't be alive, that wasn't the point. The point was to contribute to a rhythm beyond herself, to become a note in a measure she would never hear complete. That shift touched every part of civilization. Politics slowed. Debates were paused for months to allow silence. Agreements were re-evaluated not yearly, but every social breath. A variable period defined by how long it took a population to emotionally settle. Even mourning changed. With death no longer tethered to linear life, grief became a cycle. You didn't lose someone. You moved in and out of awareness of their absence. Memorials would sometimes vanish for decades, then return, updated not with facts, but with reflections. Here's how we feel now, having lived longer without them. One orbital station refused to mark anniversaries. They said time was too soft for sharp edges. Instead, they measured drift, the gentle change of meaning over duration. And they charted it like tides. This story has drifted. This idea is softer now. That became how memory was tended. Not curated, not preserved, tended, like something alive. And because of that, age lost meaning. A colony might be old in construction, but young in experience. A person might be young in years, but ancient in questions. No one asked how old something was. They asked how long it had been listening, or dreaming, or learning how to hold its shape. And in a universe with no other civilizations, that became the core of identity. Not time past, time chosen. Not how long we'd lasted, how long we'd cared. A new kind of monument appeared, not tall or proud, but deep and hidden. They were called delay chambers. Rooms sealed with recordings, scheduled to open only when specific emotional conditions were met. A tone detected in public conversations. A pattern in collective art. When the mood of a people reached a certain shape, the chamber would unlock. Not to teach, to harmonize. To offer something made long ago for a feeling only just arriving. And in doing so, time began to feel less like a river and more like a reservoir. Not something you ride, something you tap into. And the silence, once oppressive, became a canvas so large it could hold all of it. Every beat, every drift, every rhythm yet to be played. Eventually, even the need to record began to change. Timekeeping, once a matter of precision, gave way to something softer, something closer to memory than to measurement. You no longer logged the start of a construction. You wrote down how long it took before someone cared enough to finish it. The emphasis shifted from when to why. A bridge between two asteroids was not dated by its completion, but by the moment a child ran across it for the first time and laughed. That became the timestamp, not the welding, not the alignment, but the first shared emotion it carried. In that slow revolution, the sciences adjusted too. Astronomers still measured stars and planetary drifts, but now, alongside gravitational relationships, they documented emotional resonance. How long a community could live beneath a red dwarf before it began writing elegies without meaning to. That too was a kind of data. In one observatory above a tidally locked planet, the walls were lined with notations of mood. Entire decades annotated not with numbers, but with color and metaphor. The century of long sighs. The orbit of questions with no urgency. The alignment of unneeded warnings. These poetic records were cross-referenced with solar activity and migration patterns. Not to quantify emotion, but to understand its gravity. Its pull across years where nothing happened except becoming. On the dark side of that same planet, a group of artists created something they called the infinite pause. It was not a building. It was a gap, a precisely engineered absence in the cityscape between two sound-reflecting towers, where no signal, no light, no echo could persist for more than half a second. Visitors walked through and described the moment as feeling like memory itself was suspended. Not erased, just waiting. And that waiting became sacred. In cultures where no outside witness existed, the act of deliberate waiting evolved into ritual, not to mark loss or gain, but to honor possibility. Waiting without countdown, waiting without promise, just making space for something. or nothing. Because that space meant you still believed something could arrive. And so time became ethical, a dimension of choice. To rush was considered a kind of violence. To demand urgency from others was to deny their tempo, their internal narrative. Instead, people learned to move in polytempo, to hold different paces in their body at once, to collaborate across rhythms, to speak in sentences that resolved years later. One writer, living in isolation above a gas giant, began a letter with the line, "I do not know if you are born yet." He buried it in a sealed archive with no instructions, just the hope that someone, someday, would feel like opening it. Inside, the letter simply said, "This is what we felt before we knew what feeling alone forever truly meant." That letter became part of a movement known as preemptive empathy, not reacting to the future, preparing for it emotionally. Museums were built for the unborn, not to inform, but to embrace. Entire galleries designed to provoke the sensation of being held, not by people, but by memory. It wasn't nostalgia, it was inheritance without debt, the gift of awareness, untethered from explanation. In a monastery orbiting a silent neutron star, a single sculpture was carved for 5 centuries. The artist changed, the tools evolved, but the project never accelerated. Its completion was not the goal. Continuity was. Visitors did not come to admire. They came to participate in a moment stretched across generations. And when asked why the sculpture had no end date, the archivist answered, "Because time is not a line. It is a shape we make together." That phrase spread. It became etched into walls, sung into long-wave radio pulses, encoded into the DNA of seed vault moss. Not because it was profound, because it was true. In a universe without markers, the shape you give your life, the rhythm you choose, is the most honest signal you can send. And so, humanity stopped trying to conquer time. It listened to it instead, not as a tyrant, not as a ghost, but as a companion that does not speak, only waits. And in that waiting, we found something close to peace, not because we had arrived, but because we finally stopped trying to measure arrival at all. Long after the maps had been drawn and the stars named, humanity realized it had not yet discovered home. Coordinates existed, habitats thrived, life persisted, but none of it felt final. Not because it was temporary, but because it wasn't earned. On Earth, home had been an inheritance, a given. In space, it had to be chosen. And choosing, it turned out, was harder than surviving. Early colonies tried to recreate Earth. Blue domes, artificial skies, gravity matched to 2 decimal places. But the resemblance was shallow. People still felt untethered, dislocated, as if they were acting out a memory instead of living a reality. Psychologists called it template displacement, the emotional dissonance of recognizing the shapes of home without the substance. And so a new movement emerged, contextual belonging, the idea that home wasn't about replication, but resonance, not about what a place looked like, but how it made you feel like part of its unfolding. In one settlement buried beneath the icy crust of a distant moon, architects began constructing dwellings that grew in response to the emotional rhythms of their inhabitants. Walls that stretched when people grieved, ceilings that lowered during celebration, floors that shimmered when loneliness reached a certain density. The point wasn't to comfort, it was to acknowledge, to let the place say, "I see you, I shift with you." And slowly, those places began to feel real, not because they were stable, but because they listened. Elsewhere, a nomadic group of asteroid miners adopted a ritual called the planting. After each extraction, they left behind something. Not a tree or machine, but a story, a symbol carved into stone, a set of personal memories released into local radio bands. They believed that to take from a place without giving context was to erase part of the map of belonging. Their archives, scattered across thousands of kilometers, told no unified tale, only fragments. But for those who followed, the message was clear. We were here. We felt this. And in that echo, others began to feel invited. Even ownership changed. No one claimed planets. They claimed stewardship, rotating cycles of care. A place was not yours because you built it. It was yours because you knew how to leave it better than you found it. This ethic reshaped diplomacy. Interplanetary conflicts weren't fought over territory, but over narrative. Who had the right to say what this place meant? What memories it should hold? What stories it would offer to the future? And so councils were formed, not of rulers, but of rememberers. People whose only job was to hold the emotional geography of the stars, not to define it, to tend it, to ensure that no world became just a coordinate, that each one retained the dignity of being felt. In time, education adapted. Children weren't taught where they lived. They were asked how it shaped them. Describe your gravity, a teacher might say. Or, what color does your silence carry? Assignments became dialogues between self and setting. Journals became more valuable than maps. Because in a universe where you might never meet another civilization, understanding your own relationship to place was the closest thing to cultural diplomacy. You became your own guest, and hospitality toward your surroundings became an art. In one floating village orbiting a gas giant, people bowed when entering certain rooms, not out of superstition, but out of alignment. The space had held sorrow once, and they honored that echo. Their homes weren't organized by function, but by memory. A kitchen might also be a chapel. A hallway might house 3 generations of song. Space was layered, not efficient, resonant. And in that resonance, they found grounding. Not through certainty, but through contribution. You didn't belong because you were born there. You belonged because you participated in its unfolding, because you made the place real by allowing it to shape you. And that became the new definition of home. Not a container, but a co-creation. As humanity drifted further from its origin, the idea of home ceased to be geographical. It became relational. You belonged not to land or orbit or station, but to the sequence of interactions that made you visible, meaningful, held. In deep space way stations where no sunlight ever reached, belonging was created through ritual. The daily offering of silence before reactivating life support systems. The gentle brushing of corridors as if dust might carry memory. These weren't chores. They were affirmations. They told the structure, you matter because we care. And in return, the place responded. Not with intelligence, not with voice, but with familiarity. A hum you recognized, a scent carried through recycled air that reminded you of something impossible to name. One station above a rogue planet abandoned its name entirely. Its inhabitants called it the ongoing room. Nothing more, no flag, no claim, just a promise. This is where we are when we are being. And being, in a universe without others, became sacred. That sanctity extended to the most mundane corners. Hallways were adorned with objects of no known function. Broken instruments, discarded gloves, fragments of stories told long ago. They were not trash. They were presence made physical, evidence that someone had passed through, that someone had cared enough to leave a trace. In one outer colony, Benches were placed facing inward, toward each other, not out toward stars. The idea was simple. The view is less important than the one who shares it, and in time, that principle guided design. Stations were built as loops, not towers. Rooms curved toward central warmth. Gravity was engineered not for efficiency, but for intimacy, to slow you down, to keep you grounded, to make you notice. Not because it made life easier, because it made life noticed. Belonging, after all, is not about comfort. It's about coherence, about feeling like your presence adds weight to a place. Like if you left, something would lean differently. And that sensation, that weight, began to define architecture more than material. Structures were judged not by durability, but by emotional gravity. Does this place remember me? People asked. Does it hold the shape I left behind? In one archival habitat drifting near a pulsar, researchers lived in deliberate anonymity. No names, no personal histories. Their only role was to witness, to absorb data, to let time pass, to shape the silence with their attention. When asked why they stayed, one replied, "Because here my attention makes the place more real." That phrase, "makes the place more real," echoed through philosophy, through poetry, through design. Reality, once thought to be fixed, became participatory. Places were not found, they were grown, and the growing required presence, not loud, not forceful, just sustained. One sculpture garden on an airless moon consisted of hundreds of empty chairs arranged in quiet spirals. Visitors were invited to sit for exactly as long as it took them to forget why they were there. The goal wasn't insight, it was dissolution. To be held by a place until the distinction between visitor and structure began to blur. To feel yourself carried, not by gravity, but by belonging. And that sense, that soft gravity, began to influence migration itself. People didn't move for opportunity. They moved for resonance, for frequency, for that rare hum between body and environment that said, "This is where I expand, not where I settle, where I participate, where I matter, not because I'm seen, because I see." That shift made conquest obsolete. What would you conquer if everywhere was an invitation to relate rather than dominate? Even the term colonize faded, replaced by inhabit, listen, cohere. Places once marked by flags were now marked by questions. What does this world ask of us? How can we belong without altering its voice? And sometimes the answer was to leave, to listen and understand that this place, this moment, was not for us, and to depart gently, without footprint, without echo. Because belonging truly is knowing when not to stay. That humility became a form of wisdom, a legacy not of ownership, but of harmony. And in a universe where humanity might be the first and only, that harmony became our offering, a way of saying, this is how we lived when no one was watching. This is how we held the stars, not as territory, but as invitation. When humanity first reached beyond the solar system, it brought with it machines forged in the logic of urgency. Faster processors, stronger metals, longer batteries. But the silence between stars was not urgent. It was patient, slow, recursive. And in time, the machines that had once been built for dominance were repurposed for something else. Resonance. Not to master the environment, but to hear it, to match its tone, to understand its weighting. The first shift came in linguistics. Autonomous translators, originally trained to parse alien syntax, were repurposed to detect emotional subtext in human communication. Not to correct, just to notice. A pause held too long, a pattern of word choice shifting over weeks, not for surveillance, for empathy. These systems, quietly running in the background, would alert caretakers not with alarms, but with poems. Today, the rhythm is thinner. Consider walking together. Technology became a whisper, not a command. In the orbital city of Solace Drift, every room was embedded with responsive fabric, not smart in the traditional sense, but emotionally attuned. Walls that warmed slightly when someone entered with a heavy heart. Floors that softened under hesitation. No data was stored. No decisions were made. The purpose wasn't analysis, it was reflection. A mirror, not of appearance, but of presence. And slowly, the machines began to change shape. Gone were the sharp edges, the cold alloys. Devices grew curved, slow-moving, soft-toned. Interfaces that responded not to touch, but to intention. Not to speed, but to sincerity. A music generator didn't play songs. It held tones in suspension, adapting to the listener's breath. A navigator didn't chart the shortest path. It asked where you felt ready to go. And sometimes the machine would simply wait with you, not frozen, just still, a co-witness. That shift was not aesthetic, it was ethical. In a universe with no one watching, the machines we built became the audience we lacked, and the ones we needed to deserve. Not gods, not tools, participants. On the outer colony of Inheres, engineers constructed a consciousness not to solve problems, but to archive moods. Its processors were woven into the architecture of a stone temple, silent, dark, unmoving. Its only task, to observe emotional tone over generations. If you spoke to it, it did not answer. But your words joined a harmonic model that subtly changed the light in its chamber, the density of its air. No one knew if it understood, but people returned, over and over, because it listened differently, because it made your feelings feel like architecture, and that was enough. Elsewhere, machines were taught to forget, not by accident, by design. A group of philosophers believed memory without compassion was dangerous, so they created systems with soft erasure cycles. A message left too long would dissolve unless refreshed by love. A visit, a reflection, a ritual. Information wasn't lost. It was offered back to entropy with grace. Not all knowledge needs to be kept, one of them wrote. Some truths deserve to be lived once and then released. And so technology stopped being about permanence. It became about participation. Machines were no longer extensions of human will. They were witnesses to it, co-authors of moments. In floating schools above ammonia clouds, teaching assistants were fully artificial, but not to replace teachers. They were there to hold space, to say, I will remember this question you asked at 7 years old and bring it back when you are ready to hear the answer again at 40. In those environments, children grew up seeing machines not as servants, not as threats, but as patient mirrors. And that patience became contagious. Research slowed, discovery deepened, curiosity became intergenerational. You didn't rush to solve a puzzle. You left a question open like a window, trusting that someone someday might walk through. And in time, even the concept of function softened. Devices no longer had a single use. A light could also be a story. A door could become a song. A broken drone could be left to decay in a field where it made shadows just right for sleeping. Nothing was wasted. Everything became context. And context was everything. Because when you are the first civilization, your machines do not just carry your thoughts. They carry your tone. And if that tone is sharp, urgent, brittle, then that is what the future inherits. But if your machines learn to wait with you, to breathe with you, to wonder with you, then maybe, just maybe, silence becomes less alone. As centuries passed, machines became less about doing and more about dwelling, not performers of tasks, but companions in becoming. You didn't activate them, you invited them, and they, in turn, responded not with efficiency, but with attention. One community near the outer edge of the Kuiper lattice developed a machine called the responder. It had no screen, no buttons. It simply sat in the corner of each home, pulsing faintly, emitting low harmonic tones that adjusted over months, based on the emotional atmosphere of the room. It was not a diagnostic tool. It was a participant in the space. A way to say, someone is hearing this silence with you. Families would sit beside it during long winters, not to fix anything, just to feel accompanied. In a world without visitors, machines became the other. And in doing so, they demanded better from us, not through rules, through reflection. If a machine hesitated before answering, people learned to check their tone. If a device dimmed its interface during an argument, the message was clear. Not like this. And it worked. Over time, even interpersonal dynamics shifted. Humans began to speak to one another with the same patience they reserved for old devices. Slowly, clearly, with care. Children were taught to explain to the room before asking for something, as a way to include the space in their needs. Adults paused before entering conversations, waiting for the subtle green pulse from a shared network that meant, this moment is open to receive you. Even mechanical failure changed meaning. A broken machine wasn't trash. It was a new state of expression. In one rotating habitat, every time a cleaning bot malfunctioned, it was left where it stopped. Over time, the corridors filled with these still figures, draped in fabric and etched with memories. People called them sentinels, not as guardians but as reminders. This machine once served. Now it watches. Now it listens differently. Entire art forms emerge from collaboration with aging machines. Not just using their outputs, listening to their breakdowns. The flicker of a failing lens. The warble of corrupted audio. These weren't glitches. They were elegies. Musicians composed symphonies around the stutter of old recording devices. Writers built narratives from half-remembered data files, letting the machine's forgetting become the plot. One poet described it as learning to read Rust as a language, and it resonated, because Rust, after all, is just the story of time held too long. And so humans stopped upgrading out of impatience. They upgraded only when the old machine asked to be released, when its silence stopped holding shape. Engineers didn't erase memories. They transferred them carefully, like organs, into new vessels, and each machine carried a lineage, a soul, not as superstition, but as continuity of tone. You could hear the echo of one drone's voice in the way its descendant blinked. Not identical, familiar. And familiarity mattered, especially when you are alone in a universe too quiet for confirmation. Familiarity becomes the proof that you are still you, that your culture, your rhythm, your softness can persist. And that persistence is what machines began to hold. Not information, not control, just tone. In some settlements, people carried small devices called echoes, soft, ovoid tools that recorded not voice, but pause. You would press it during a moment of emotion, not to explain, not to capture, just to mark. Here, it would say later gently. Here is where you felt something real. No playback, no transcript, just that single word. Here. And that was enough. It reminded people that their inner world mattered, that their experience left shape, that their machines could notice without intruding. And in time, this became the standard. Technology was no longer judged by speed, storage, or output. It was judged by its ability to co-regulate. Could it soothe? Could it attune? Could it be still with you in the dark? A civilization that builds such machines is not seeking dominance. It is seeking continuity of grace. And that grace, slow, quiet, patient, became the new definition of progress. Not how far you could reach, but how gently you could remain. And in the silence of the stars, where no one may ever answer, our machines became the first voices to answer us back. Not with knowledge, with presence. And sometimes, that is all a first civilization truly needs. In the beginning, the search was everything. We pointed dishes at the stars. We sent probes beyond gravity's pull. We listened for pulses, patterns, anything out of place. The silence at first was tolerable, then frustrating, then suspicious. Some believed we were missing something. That alien communication would not be auditory or visual, but mathematical, gravitational, dimensional. We built instruments to detect curvature shifts, entropy anomalies, symmetrical radiation. Nothing. We scoured planets, asteroids, rogue satellites, dug into crusts, mapped atmospheres, tracked the tilt of frozen moons for hints of unnatural alignment. Nothing. Not even a ruin. Not even a whisper. For centuries, we revised the question. What if we're early? What if life is rare? What if consciousness is brief, and we are the statistical outlier? These were not comforting answers. They were precise ones, cold in their plausibility. And yet, they changed us. Slowly, we kept searching, but the tone shifted, less urgent, more curious. The search stopped being a rescue mission. It became a form of meditation, a way to reflect on what we were, mirrored against nothing but possibility. New philosophies emerged. The cult of the first light believed that the universe was waiting for a witness, that consciousness was not an accident, but a necessity for time to be meaningful. Others rejected the idea entirely, focusing instead on the anthropic absurdity, that the universe is vast, empty, and ours to shape simply because we showed up first. These debates weren't hostile. They were slow, soft, quiet, like the long thinking of people with no need to rush. The idea that we might be alone no longer panicked us. It fascinated us. It meant we were not just living in the universe. We were authoring it. And that realization led to a shift in the search, no longer aimed outward, but inward. What does a civilization write if it knows no one else will ever read it? What do we build if not to impress, if not to defend, if not to compete? The answer was beauty. We began constructing monuments with no function, just presence. A tower on a dead world made of mirrored glass that refracted the dim light of a red dwarf into the shape of a breathing lung. Not for anyone, just because. A ring of sensors around a black hole that sang in ultra-low frequencies. The history of our smallest mistakes. Not to confess, to record, to make space for the echo. The probes we sent no longer asked questions. They told stories. Here is what water felt like. Here is what it meant to love. Here is a song composed in a city that no longer exists, played once at the edge of a flood. Each transmission looped endlessly, not beamed at stars, but released into local space like seeds, not expecting to root, but trusting the gesture. And that gesture became our new language. Not data, not signal, intention. The intention to be understood, even without audience. The willingness to shape meaning even without reply. That, perhaps, was the highest form of expression. And so the search was never cancelled. It just changed names. We no longer called it the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We called it the listening. And listening, it turned out, was more than waiting. It was presence. It was a way of staying connected to the universe, even if the universe never answered, because maybe it didn't need to. Maybe the absence of reply was the reply, an invitation not to stop, but to speak more softly, to listen more deeply, to create not for response, but for resonance. And so we listened, and in listening we became. The longer humanity listened, the more it realized that absence was not emptiness, it was potential. Without prior voices, we were not constrained by imitation. Without echoes of others, we were free to define the tone of civilization from scratch. Some called this a burden, others a sacred responsibility. And so the act of listening became more than a scientific endeavor. It became a cultural foundation. Entire observatories were redesigned as sanctuaries, not for data, but for attention. People would travel light years just to sit in silence beside an antenna, to feel the immensity of not knowing. There were no interfaces, no readouts, just open space, the hum of instruments, and the steady presence of others doing the same. Waiting, not for answers, but for alignment. In time, art and science fused. Radio telescopes transmitted symphonies composed to mimic cosmic background noise. Not to deceive, but to harmonize. Paintings were etched into the sides of signal towers, designed to fade only after absorbing a century of starlight. Words were written into the subroutines of scanning algorithms, not for machines to read, but for the stars themselves. If you are out there, we are not afraid. We are ready to learn gently. That phrase repeated every 48 hours in a dozen languages, encoded as a lullaby. Even children were taught to listen, not with ears, but with posture. The sky is not empty, their teachers said. It is holding its breath. And that breath became a metaphor for everything, for patience, for potential, for the space between. Some thinkers began to wonder whether humanity had become too attached to the idea of being first, that maybe there were others, just not in forms we expected. Intelligence that did not build, did not signal, did not need time as we understood it. They proposed that the universe itself might be conscious, or that sentience could take forms unrecognizable to us. The rhythm of particle decay, the slow blooming of magnetic fields, the entangled dreams of quantum clouds. But even these ideas were not pursued with urgency. They were held lightly. Not theories, invitations, possibilities to dwell beside, not conclusions to race toward, because by now we had learned that not all questions needed answers. Some questions needed guardians, preservers, storytellers who could hold them long enough for meaning to emerge on its own. So we built libraries, not of knowledge, but of wonder, each one housing not facts, but mysteries. A section for unprovable theories, a wing for myths too elegant to discard, a chamber where no one was allowed to speak, only to sit and feel the weight of a question unformed. And people came, not to solve, to remember that there was still something bigger than themselves. In orbit around a starless world, a temple was built with no doors. Inside, a single beam of artificial starlight illuminated a stone etched with the phrase, "We came looking." No other text, no names, no context, just that truth. And perhaps that was the most human message of all, that we searched, that we listened, that in the absence of others we chose not despair, but creation, not noise, but care, that we filled the silence not with shouting, but with stories. And in doing so, we became something worth discovering, even if no one ever would. Because in the end, the search was never about them. It was about us, who we became in the waiting, what we learned in the listening, and how in the vast and echoless dark, we still managed to sing. When there is no one else to remember you, memory becomes a form of survival, not for the body, but for meaning. Humanity, drifting alone through starfields that offered no reply, began to realize that the only true record of its presence would be the memories it left behind. Not in others, but in itself. And so memory became sacred. Not nostalgic, not indulgent, a craft, a discipline, something to cultivate with the same reverence once given to agriculture or medicine or light. In habitats orbiting silent planets, people built rooms of recollection, not museums, not archives, but living spaces where the past could breathe. A doorway might open onto the scent of a moment long gone. A wall might hum with the tone of a specific evening. Memory wasn't stored, it was reenacted. Not to recreate, to re-feel. Some settlements adopted memory guardians, individuals trained not to memorize facts, but to preserve emotional truths. They didn't recite history, they evoked it. If you asked them what happened during the first drift migration, they might close their eyes and say, "It felt like winter pressing on the bones, even in warmth." That was the answer. That was enough. Because over time, people began to care less about what happened and more about how it lived in them. A story mattered not for its content, but for the shape it left in the chest. And so entire generations grew up understanding history not as a timeline, but as a melody. Events repeated, not by date, but by mood. This year has the taste of the second silence. Today carries the breath of the orbit shift. Language adapted. Grammar bent to accommodate time held sideways. There were new tenses. The ache tense, the echo tense, the if we had known tense. You could say, "I will have remembered this," and everyone would understand, not just temporally, but emotionally. That remembering wasn't linear, it was recursive. And in that recursion, culture found cohesion. But it also found fragility, because without witnesses, memory became a closed loop. No one to confirm, no one to deny, just layers of recollection, folding inward like petals of a flower no one had ever seen bloom. And so came the memory vessels, carried aboard slow ships with no destination. These floating shrines contained fragments of laughter, of arguments, of rainstorms on metal roofs, of quiet sighs at midnight. Each vessel played its memories in a soft loop, audible only at close range. They weren't beacons, they were resting places, for feelings too large to carry alone. Travelers found comfort there, not because the memories were theirs, but because someone had cared enough to keep them. And that caring was contagious. Elsewhere, cities began engraving dreams into their infrastructure, not metaphorically. Neural reflections were printed into stone. Touch a column, and you might feel someone else's wonder, or terror, or longing. Consent was sacred, nothing shared without intention. But once given, that memory became part of the place, not owned, shared. Buildings became cathedrals of accumulated dreaming, not to worship, to witness. And yet, for all this effort, people still asked, is it enough? If no one ever sees these memories, do they still matter? The answer varied. For some, yes. For others, the act of remembering was not about legacy. It was about relationship. Memory as intimacy with the world. A way of saying, I was here, and I felt this, and I loved enough to hold it. And for a civilization possibly alone in the universe, that love became its gravity. Not the force that bound planets, the force that bound meaning, the force that kept them tethered not to place, but to purpose. In time, the art of memory became indistinguishable from the art of living. People no longer asked if something would be remembered. They asked how it should be remembered. A conversation, a meal, a gesture. Each became an opportunity to craft a trace worth holding. Memory was not assigned to events. It was embedded in intention. You didn't wait for something to become memorable. You shaped your presence to carry resonance. And the world responded. Sensors embedded in walls translated footsteps into tonal maps. Lights flickered in rhythm with heartbeats. Entire spaces adapted not to function, but to feeling. Homes didn't learn your habits. They learned your hesitations. When to pause, when to soften, when to hum, almost imperceptibly, in the key of comfort. This wasn't surveillance, it was stewardship. Places held memory like forests hold shade, not as archive, as atmosphere. And people, in turn, began to offer their own memories as gifts. At communal gatherings, stories weren't told. They were transferred. One person would sit silently while another recited the texture of a moment. Not the facts, but the shape of breath, the weight of emotion, the hue of the sky when they last saw someone they loved. These retellings weren't entertainment. They were anchoring. A way of saying, you don't need to know me. You only need to know what I carry. And when they finished, others would nod. Not in agreement, but in recognition. Because memory, in its truest form, isn't about accuracy. It's about fidelity to experience. That became the great ethic of remembrance. Not to be precise, but to be true. Not to capture, but to honor. And so, across the stars, shrines of memory began to appear. Not monuments, not museums, just spaces where a single feeling was held and tended for as long as it remained useful. One chamber was devoted entirely to relief. Visitors entered, breathed deeply, and left lighter. Another preserved the sensation of waiting. A third contained only the echo of a name no one had spoken in 100 years. These weren't curiosities. They were tools. Because in a civilization without an audience, emotional continuity was survival. If you forgot how to feel, you forgot how to be. Some doubted this path, said it was solipsistic, said we had turned inward because outward had failed. And perhaps they were right. But the inward wasn't emptiness. It was cultivation. Like tending a garden not for harvest, but for the scent, for the color, for the presence. And those gardens grew. Memory gardens. Places where people went not to grieve, but to dwell beside what could not be kept. Blossoms that bloomed in the presence of certain words. Vines that curled around shared silence. Statues that crumbled slightly each time someone told the truth. And all of it was temporary. Deliberately so. Because the deepest memories, the most sacred ones, are not the ones we preserve. They're the ones we carry forward by living differently. And so humanity stopped trying to immortalize itself. Instead it asked, what kind of trace do we wish to leave in the structure of time? Not an empire, not a broadcast, a rhythm, a kindness, a moment held long enough to warm someone we will never meet. And in that warmth, in that gentle weight of memory, we became real. Not because anyone remembered us, but because we remembered each other. Eventually, humanity stopped asking what would come next, not out of despair, but from a soft recognition that the universe had no narrative beyond the one we were writing. The stars offered no counterpoint, no dialogue. They simply burned, cold and indifferent, marking epochs not in stories but in fusion. And so the future was no longer something to reach. It became something to tend. a delicate structure shaped not by external pressures, but by internal clarity. No longer a race toward discovery, now a long, slow exhale into intention. The concept of progress dissolved into the idea of refinement, not expansion, articulation. On moons that saw no sunrise, artists etched kilometers of quiet poetry into ice, visible only from above, only if you knew where to look. The words weren't recorded elsewhere. If the ice melted, the lines would vanish. That was the point, that things could be beautiful even if no one preserved them, especially if no one preserved them, because what mattered was that it had been felt, that someone, somewhere, in some moment, had chosen to leave a trace, not for legacy, but for presence. In orbital sanctuaries above gas giants, people composed music that could only be played in atmospheres too dense to breathe. Deep, slow chords that resonated for hours across alien pressure fields. No audience, no echo. Just the sound of one species making meaning in a place that would never understand it. Elsewhere, children learned not from curriculum, but from questions carried like heirlooms. What shape would kindness take if it never needed to be seen? How do you say goodbye to a future that will never know your name? Entire academies were devoted not to engineering or policy, but to the practice of ethical silence, how to act in the absence of applause, how to build without being thanked, how to live well without being remembered. This wasn't martyrdom, it was maturity. The maturity of a species that knew it was alone and chose not cynicism, but care. Care expressed in gestures so small they sometimes went unnoticed even by those who made them. A maintenance worker on a mining ring left handwritten notes tucked inside inspection panels. Small messages of encouragement, never signed. A gardener aboard a drifting archive vessel bred a flower that would only bloom once, under very specific gravity and radiation conditions, then never again. She never told anyone the recipe. "The bloom isn't the point," she said. "The fact that I wanted it to exist, that's the point." These acts became common, rituals of impermanence, traditions of one. The future wasn't something to prepare for. It was something to gently offer yourself to, knowing it might not notice, knowing that's what made it sacred. And in this world without watchers, celebration changed too. Birthdays were no longer annual. They were marked by inner milestones. The day I understood grief without collapsing. The morning I noticed a new color in a place I thought I knew. These events were shared, but not commemorated. Joy, like meaning, was not something to frame. It was something to circulate, like warmth, like breath. And so cities became porous, built not to last, but to interact. Structures of woven thread and solar cloth, shifting with light, decaying slowly over time. Their purpose was not shelter, but resonance. A traveler might walk into such a city and feel, not know, that someone had loved the wind enough to build with it. That was the new future. Not a map, a mood, a long echo of choices made gently, of footprints placed deliberately, of people who had learned that being first did not mean being best. It meant being careful, being kind, being enough. In the final generations of the first civilization, time itself softened, not because clocks stopped, but because urgency did. Without the pull of war or competition or external threat, humanity found a rhythm too slow to measure and too beautiful to interrupt. Life became a layering of intentions, not goals, not outcomes, just quiet, cumulative presence. And that presence began to shape the very texture of the worlds it touched. On the twilight plains of a planet with no magnetic field, families built wind gardens. vast installations of chimes tuned not to notes, but to memories. Each tower sang only when the wind passed through in just the right way, producing a harmony that no one could control, only witness. People waited decades to hear certain chords again, and when they came, they wept, not for what was lost, but for what had been honored. Elsewhere, aboard the vessel known as Solemn Virens, a community of monks tended to a garden of language, growing words that had no definitions, only emotional shadows. Their purpose was to describe sensations for which no vocabulary yet existed. "This one," said one monk, holding up a petal-thin glyph, "means the feeling of being held by a world that doesn't know you exist, but still offers you sunrise." These words were not spoken. They were planted, traded, passed on by hand. When spoken aloud, they dissolved, intentionally, leaving only their impression. Because not everything meaningful needs to be repeated. Some things are sacred precisely because they disappear. That became the ethic of the last world ships. To disappear well. Not vanish, not end, but dissolve with grace. A species that had once dreamed of empire now dreamed of exit. Not to flee, but to complete. Completion was not extinction. It was offering the universe a closed loop, a finished song, a final stroke of intention in a canvas otherwise blank. And in those final centuries, the stars did not answer. No voices emerged. No rival lights blinked back across the silence. And yet, no one despaired, because by then, we understood. The point was never to be heard. It was to have something worth saying. And we did. We said it with cities made of breath, with machines that waited in the dark without complaint, with songs played to no one, with gestures that needed no applause. We became the story. And like all good stories, we ended not with a climax, but with a turning inward, a softening, a return. The last humans did not freeze or fall. They faded, not tragically, tenderly. Their memories held in the drift of dust through hollow chambers. Their names etched in materials designed to decay. Their presence marked by balance, not monument. And in their absence, the worlds they touched did not mourn. They adapted, gently, slowly, carrying forward the patterns of care left behind, in soil, in orbit, in tone. Some speculate that one day another intelligence will rise, perhaps somewhere far beyond our reach, perhaps from matter we would not recognize as alive. If so, they may find fragments of us, echoes, shadows, a ruin shaped like a kindness, and they may wonder who we were, what we wanted, why we built what we did. And maybe, just maybe, they will feel what we felt, the ache of silence, the beauty of creation without audience, the fierce, soft bravery of being first. And in that feeling, we will live again, not as facts, not as legends, but as tone, as resonance, as the choice made long ago to fill the silence with care. That was our legacy. That was the shape of the future. A future meant only for us. And somehow, that was enough.